the forecasts are identical in one specific way, which is that the recovery is always next year. It's just that next year never really arrives. You probably need to have one-off debt restructuring in Southern Europe, which is going to be very difficult. But again, maybe that's the answer. And what I would strongly urge is that bankers, particularly senior bankers, should be effectively forced to stick to some kind of equivalent of a medical code of ethics.
Well, his talk is first class, and I particularly like is the way he mentioned about the punishment and retribution things, because if a banker do what they like and don't have punishment, or just created himself as big as possible fat cat situation, there should be some kind of restriction on it and some kind of punishment on it.
I think it's great engaging industry folk with academia, be it staff or students. And I think if you could have more of these, definitely these type of events, you would create a much better alignment of where the education sector is going, what are they researching, and what's actually needed in the industry. I think it was very good.
You know, we do need, I mean, we saw it in the graphs, you know, that Asia is growing like crazy. It's not just China, I mean, the whole of Asia is growing like crazy. And we need to be engaged with these people, we really do. And we need to get, you know, better terms of trade and so forth, and intellectual property protection and all the sort of things that make a sensible modern economy. Yeah, sure, we do. We need that. So the more information we can get, the more exchange of views we can get, the better.
I wanted to kick off with one of my favourite charts, which just goes to show how extraordinary the shift in Asia has been over the last few years. China has delivered in each of the last 30 or 40 years, every 10 years, an improvement in living standards, which took the US 50 years to achieve back at the end of the 18th century and through the course of the 19th century. And that, to my mind, is an extraordinarily epic change in economic performance. And bear in mind, it's affecting so many people at the same time. China, of course, is an enormous population. We've seen these kinds of stories before in, say, Japan or South Korea, but never on this kind of scale. So this is really a remarkable part of the story. I also want to note that this is not China's story alone. It's also a story for India. India is perhaps not quite so impressive as China, but in India's case, the ratio effectively is that India achieves every 10 years what it took the US every 30 years to achieve. So this is a remarkable reshaping of the global economy that's occurred in a very, very short space of time. So when people say, well, how can China carry on growing in the absence of American demand or European demand, the answer is they'll sell increasingly to other parts of the emerging world. And how will the rest of the emerging world carry on growing? They'll sell increasingly to each other and to China. So one of the peculiarities before the financial crisis was that household debt levels rose rapidly. Consumers were able to keep spending even though their income wasn't rising particularly rapidly. And what you ended up with was a big increase in income inequality, but not necessarily a big increase in consumption inequality because people had access to debt or to credit. Of course, since the global financial crisis, that's all changed. People are now much more aware of the fact that their incomes have been depressed because they can't get access to the credit. As a consequence, the people are beginning to recognize, they think, that globalization has not been entirely a free lunch for everybody. And I would argue that was one of the reasons we're seeing a return of some degree of economic nationalism, because we've got the stagnation, we haven't got the credit growth, we've got the income inequality. All these things don't look quite so nice now as had been the case before the onset of the global financial crisis. So my question is, what happens if the distortions from Asia and all those longer-term drivers of growth are beginning to fade? What happens if we're now faced with actually lower trend structural growth rates than we thought was possible before the financial crisis? How do we live within our means in these new straightened times, these more difficult times? And this is really the theme of the book that is now out. The answer so far is to pretend it's not a problem. This is what I like to call the theological option. In economic policy making, you constantly pray for a strong recovery. QE has morphed from being this rather attractive antibiotic into becoming simply an addictive painkiller. It's a different kind of story. It makes life a little easier, but doesn't really solve the underlying economic difficulties, in particular the absence of decent, strong economic growth. So if effectively QE helps to redistribute income and wealth away from those who are on wage income towards those who are financially asset rich, in aggregate, on average, you end up with a reduction in the marginal propensity to consume, which in turn suggests that actually the impact on demand is smaller than the Bank of England originally calculated. And I would like to argue, in fact, that monetary policy in this particular way is becoming more an instrument for the redistribution of income and wealth, rather than being a key driver of economic recovery. And I raise this question as to whether it should be central banks who should be responsible for these decisions with regard to the redistribution of income and wealth. Or put another way, I think the central banks are asked to do a bigger and bigger political job because the politicians themselves don't want to do it. Even in the US, which is more dynamic, the growth rates that we're seeing are much, much lower than was the case previously. I think this is a Western condition of structurally lower growth rates, which raises a whole bunch of questions about how we cope, not just economically, but also politically and socially. The French Revolution was partly a consequence of economic failure, where the distribution of that failure was seen by many in society as grossly unfair. When you have a situation whereby you end up with unexpected economic stagnation, problems of high levels of income inequality become much bigger than is the case during expanding economies. During periods of expansion, we can cope with high levels of income inequality, but when it comes to stagnation, it is much more difficult, and that's the point when you start to get political and social upheaval. I would argue that in society, in Western societies, and partly because of the banks, I have to say, there's been a breakdown of trust, which I think has eroded the ability to have those, if you like, market-driven commercial decisions, which actually has eroded growth over the course of the last few years. We know from history that ultimately creditors end up paying a big proportion of the bill, but the more they resist doing that, the worse the crisis tends to become. So although we've had all sorts of help from the ECB, I would argue that currently in the Eurozone there's still a great deal of instability to come. And that instability will also, I think, be reflected in a possible increase in political extremism, the rise of economic nationalism, political nationalism, not just in the Eurozone but also in the UK. And I would suggest it was partly a consequence of the Germans not recognising that they themselves were taking risks with their money. The Germans will eventually have to pay. And so what I would suggest is, in terms of a longer term reform, is that those countries running large current account surpluses should be in one sense penalised as much as those who are running large current account deficits. There should be downgrades from ratings agencies, not just for those with large amounts of debt, but those who are lending too much in the first place. Both of them are equally at fault. You can't have the whole world in current account surplus unless you're doing trade with Jupiter or Mars, which I think is not quite possible at this stage. So I think you need to have the creation of a political and fiscal union, and also you probably need to have one-off debt restructuring in Southern Europe, which is going to be very difficult. But again, maybe that's the answer. And what I would strongly urge is that bankers, particularly senior bankers, should be effectively forced to stick to some kind of equivalent of a medical code of ethics, certain kinds of behaviour which make very clear what the punishments are if they misbehave. I mean, if you're a doctor who misbehaves, if you misbehave pretty badly, you're struck off. If you misbehave very badly, you go to jail. And none of those things have been in place really from the point of view of bankers, and I think that maybe that's what's actually required. So on that note, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't traditionally have markets in China. You know, we know how to deal with the States, we know how to deal with Europe, we know how to deal with Australia and places like that. We don't really know how to deal with the Chinese. You know, and there's all that. There's just lack of understanding, lack of advice, lack of people who've done it before. It's a tricky one. It really is.
Asia Scholar Institute will play a very important role in becoming the bridge to connect Asia and Scotland in many areas such as education, business, culture, society, economy, trade and investment. It could be a bridge to connect everything.
This is my first talk and I'll definitely be back for more.